I built my entire worldview on rationality and logic, but my worldview is not rational or logical. Right? So this is a problem. And so once I finally crossed that bridge, I was able to sort of like put my ego aside and say, okay, you need to just start reading some stuff, the Bible. And also talking to those handful of few friends I was comfortable talking about this with. And it was a 3-year process, and it was incremental. It was like, okay, maybe there is something out there, maybe there is a creator. That was like step one. Maybe there is an afterlife, and maybe this story about Jesus really did happen, so it was like incremental, and now I'm all the way in.
Hi, I'm Jana Harmon from the eX-skeptic podcast. Have you walked away from Christianity, or you're questioning whether or not it was even true to begin with? Maybe you're asking if truth even exists, or if it's arrogant to say that one faith is right. These questions are more common than you might think. We've talked with over 120 former skeptics and atheists who've shared similar doubts and questions. That's why we've created 9 themed playlists on YouTube, drawn from personal stories of former skeptics who've wrestled with these same issues, among others. Go to eX-skeptic on YouTube and find our playlist, Is It Possible to Believe Again? Or What About Other Religions? Among others. Once you've found them, you might want to share these themed playlists with others who might have their own unique questions about faith. Hello, and welcome to eX-skeptic, the podcast that shares unlikely stories of belief, powerful stories of those who once dismissed God, but found themselves reconsidering and ultimately embracing faith in Jesus Christ. I'm your host, Jana Harmon. What happens when a staunch atheist, deeply committed to science as the only reliable path to truth, begins to question that very assumption? In this episode of eX-skeptic, we talk with Dr. Trevor Lohman, a clinical neuroscience researcher who once saw religion as a crutch for the weak-minded and science as the ultimate key to understanding reality. He was a militant atheist, bought into the popular narrative that reason and faith were fundamentally incompatible, but something shifted. When science, particularly in its reductionistic form, began to fall short in answering life's biggest questions, Trevor's intellectual honesty wouldn't allow him to ignore the gaps. His deep curiosity and willingness to reconsider long-held assumptions opened the door to a broader view, one that ultimately led him to believe in God. If you've ever wondered whether science and belief can coexist, or whether your doubts could actually be pointing you to somewhere deeper, this episode is for you. It's a conversation for anyone who values evidence, reason, and the courage to rethink what they believe. I hope you'll come along. Trevor, welcome to eX-skeptic. It's so great to have you with me today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
As we're getting started, I would love for our listeners to know a bit about you. Tell us a bit about your experience, your education, the kind of work you're doing, and even the new book that you have just released.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm a clinical research neuroscientist. My education background, I started off in cellular and molecular biology. I eventually did my doctoral work in gene expression related to aging, and then sort of took a right turn into neuroscience, and had a really great, what's called a postdoc in the research world. After you get your PhD, you kind of get another PhD because you can't seem to stop going to school. And now I'm a assistant professor at a medical school here in LA, studying the relationship between the cardiovascular system and the brain, and whether or not some of these neurodegenerative diseases might actually have a vascular cause, which is very different from the book I just wrote, which is the subject of why I'm here today, about, I hesitate to call it a scientific case for God. I don't know if science can really prove or disprove God, but I think in our culture we have come to we have a misunderstanding about what science actually is, and we sort of treat it like a worldview that explains our existence when it very clearly doesn't. And we've kind of massaged the history of science to make it look and feel a certain way. But when you actually go back and study these, fathers of modern science, they had very metaphysical, religious worldviews. And they thought they were studying God. And that's not how science really works today. So that's what the book's about.
Hmm. Yeah, I would strongly encourage anybody to get it. It's called God's Eye View. I just spent the last couple of weeks working my way through it, and it is phenomenal. It's
Thank
really,
you.
it pushes the edges of your thinking. It delves into quantum physics, but I will say that it's in a very intelligible, accessible read. Trevor makes this information not only understandable, but and in bite-sized pieces that are comprehensible, but it really challenges your own faith system, belief system, challenges you to think beyond perhaps your own current ways of thinking. So, and
Wow. Thank you.
yeah, no, it's good. I think that as science should be, it pushes the boundaries. It causes you to think, causes you to question in all the right ways.
I really appreciate that because, colleagues who have read the book, I think their impression might be that it's sort of overly critical of science, but really, I wrote it from the opposite perspective. I love science. I was fascinated by it as a kid. I still am, and I just feel like we've sort of lost our way. So the book was sort of a call to like, hey, let's get back to what we're good at, which is being curious and open minded and methodical. And that's not what science is now. And I don't believe science and God are antithetical to each other at all. I think that's a crazy idea. So thank you. That was nice to hear.
No, no, and I would like to address that question a little bit later on as
Yeah.
we're getting into your story. But let's get into your story. I know you are from LA, or at least now, but where were you when you were growing up? Tell me about just how you grew up. Talk to me about your family. Was there any
Yeah.
faith in your family at all back
Yeah.
then?
Yeah, sure. Well, I actually was born, I can almost see the hospital I was born at outside my window right here. But very quickly after I was born, I moved all over the country with my mom and my stepdad. My parents were divorced, which is a very common thing for kids of the 90s. And my stepdad was in the military, so we moved around a bit. Uh, and that was fine. Regarding religion, I mean, both of my mother and my father are both they're both believers, and I think always have been. But religion was never something we really discussed much in the home. We didn't go to church, things like that. I think if you would have asked me when I was 7 or 8 or 9, actually my daughter's 7, and I don't know if she's would say this, but probably 7, 8, or 9. If you asked me what I was, I'd probably say I was a Christian, but I wouldn't really know what that meant, right? But going to school in the 90s, elementary school, middle school in the 90s, it was an amazing time. It felt amazing. It felt like we were this close to figuring everything out. We were watching the space shuttle, we had the Human Genome Project going on, we had the Silicon Valley revolution. We had kind of learned that we can do anything with code. And then at the same time we learned we could do anything with code, we learned that there's a code inside our cells and we can sequence it and we can cure all disease and we were sort of starting to flirt with the idea that free will and what it meant to be human was all programmed in a language in a cell. And it just felt like, of course, this is the answer. It was the first time that science could really convincingly say that we've got it all figured out. We're this close. And obviously, 30 years later, that hasn't really panned out to be the case. But at the time, it makes sense why rational atheism became so big in the 2000s. It just felt so convincing if you weren't firmly rooted in a religious tradition, and I wasn't.
The scientific narrative there that you were believing, it was one of, it sounds like certainty.
Yeah.
It was probably again around the time that the new atheists were starting to rise,
Oh yeah.
and so can you speak to that? Did you have any of those kind of influences in your life that even
Yeah.
made you more certain or made you feel that it was science? a certain view, let's just say a certain view of science
Yeah.
was the more rational way to believe.
Yeah. I mean, so in the early days of that movement, it was very convincing. I mean, the way it was presented was actually that it's the believers who are certain and following sort of a blind faith. And we, as rationalists, using logic, can be much more humble and open minded and curious. That's kind of how it was sold to me. And I think everyone going, as a child back then. And it kind of made sense because there wasn't really, Protestantism was dominant, right? The American culture was very Christian. And so there was sort of this like rebellious upstart feeling in science that we're going to use our minds to solve these mysteries, but without any preconceived notions or bias. That was, I think, the sell. That's what got me in. As a curious kid who was good at math and science and things, this seemed like the way to go. Because you get to solve mysteries, and what kid doesn't want to solve mysteries, right? So anyway, so flash forward, to, I guess, undergrad. This is like peak Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, rational atheism time. And I was a complete jerk. I was like the typical militant atheist. I don't, it was bizarre. I'm embarrassed looking back on it, but I wasn't alone. There was a lot of people like that. You kind of felt superior. You felt intellectually superior. And it wasn't until, I guess, maybe grad school where I started recognizing, I guess, what I would call sort of the central lie of that rational atheist movement, which was that it wasn't unbiased. It wasn't purely logical. It wasn't purely rational. It was, in many ways, had a religious flair to it, which was kind of this cognitive dissonance in my head because I thought this was this better alternative to certainty, but in reality, it's just a different brand. There's this is now probably an overused quote, but Terence McKenna has that quote, uh, if there's a phrase that characterizes science, it's give me one miracle and we'll explain the rest. And so I'm like, yeah, even though that's kind of a cliche and overused quote, it's that we need to contend with that as scientists. Like, that's a good point, right? Um, why is there something rather than nothing? And if science had been very like open-minded and humble and said, yeah, it's a good question. There's certainly some room for God in there, right? There's a lot of questions we don't have answers to, but that's not what they did. They dug their heels in and said, no, we know this is the way we can explain this and that. And, Dawkins and Hitchens were very condescending to these types of questions because they didn't have answers. And so you start to realize like, oh, okay, that I need to actually go back and re-examine the last 20 years of my life.
Sometimes I think it's helpful to understand the way that beliefs are not only formed, which obviously you're telling me it was the more intelligent, more scientific view of reality. With that view, there are certain limitations of the way in which, like you say, you can even answer the bigger questions, like you were beginning to ask, whether or not science could explain them. But how did you manage those bigger questions in your own life before you even started asking those bigger questions of science?
Yeah. So if, my belief system, if you could call it that, which I think you can call atheism a belief system. This is like actually a very deep conversation and difficult to untangle looking back at my time as an atheist, because atheism sort of stole a lot of religious tenets from Christianity, right? Atheism only worked because we kind of inherited the morality of Christianity. We could say we're atheists, and someone might say, well, then how do you distinguish between right and wrong? And we're like, well, of course we know how to distinguish between right and wrong, as if we came up with morality. Like, no, this was all already kind of handed to the rational atheist movement, this Christian morality. And so in a way, you could kind of do some mental gymnastics in your mind to convince yourself, like, your belief system was not only right but morally superior because of all of these things that the media had told us about Christianity and the church and all these sort of negative connotations to Christianity. You kind of could walk around with like this air of superiority as long as you didn't really examine those deep questions. And I didn't. Right. So to answer your question, that was a trick. You just don't think about it. And I think as you get older, your ability to just ignore those big questions diminishes. Especially after having kids, and you start going like, yeah, what is the meaning of this, and how do I really know what's right and what's wrong, and why is there something rather than nothing? Those aren't questions that any atheist can deal with directly. They have like little strategies for just like swatting those questions away. But even Christopher Hitchens said that those are the questions that gave him pause. you know, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe appear to be finely tuned for life? And so to hear that from someone like him, who's made his whole life out of trying to debate Christians and all religious people, I think those are the questions that get you, and rightly so. But how did I deal with them before I became a Christian? I just didn't, I guess, would be the answer.
You just didn't address them. You were more just curious about
I
your
just
own.
I tried to ignore them, right? And
Uh,
you try to come up with like quick little explanations if someone challenges you on those types of questions, but um, they're typically snide and critical. Like, you know, why does the universe appear finely tuned for life? Well, that's just because you happen to be in the part of the universe where life exists, and the universe is huge, and most of the universe isn't finely tuned for life. And so this is just this form of bias that you as a simple-minded believer have, and that's not right. When you start digging into it actually, you you have to make a lot of assumptions and a lot of faith-based arguments to be an atheist. And so that's something that I've heard many people say before.
yeah, and you said at the beginning of that prior answer too that, or you made the contention that atheism is a belief system of sorts. Oftentimes today you'll hear, I just merely lack a belief in God.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't have to prove anything. The onus of proof or the burden of proof is on your side, you who believe in
That's
God.
it. That
So
is that is the everything hangs on that little argument, is where's the burden of proof? And I've used that line many times as an atheist, and it's completely ineffective. You know, you can't make the claim that all matter in the universe exploded out of a single pinprick at the center of the universe, and that as this matter is spiraling out of control through the universe, complexity emerges. First of all, it violates the second law of thermodynamics, but just put that aside for a second. Complexity emerges, and consciousness emerges, and subjective human experience emerges. And I don't need to explain that, right? All I have to do is say you're wrong for your explanation. That's, of course, ridiculous. And it's not scientific either. Scientists should have said, yeah, that's a great question, and we don't have an answer, and we should be willing to explore these ideas. And they did. Early scientists were like that. Scientists of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and even the early 20th century, they acted like that. It's only very recently that science became this worldview, an alternative to God.
so you were beginning to question perhaps the limitations of the form or oh, of science, scientism, or more reductionistic view of science, and its inability to answer these bigger questions.
Yeah.
So walk us through that and talk with us about how that started opening you to other possibilities and what that looked like.
Yeah. Well, I started to feel like a hypocrite. And if there was something that always, for some reason, bothered me, even as a kid, it was hypocrisy, right? And that was one of the amazing things about reading the New Testament for the first time, was like, it really bothered Jesus too. Hypocrisy is something that he did not like. And anyway, but before I got there, um, I felt like a hypocrite because I said, I would claim that it's foolish or simple or uh, you're making a lot of assumptions in your arguments. And then, the Terence McKenna quote, give us a miracle and we'll explain the rest. It's like, give us 100 miracles. We're asking for 100 miracles. We're asking for the Big Bang, which actually was a religious idea. George Lemaitre, a priest, proposed that idea. And Einstein famously argued against it, and all these physicists argued against it. And now it's the bedrock of the scientific explanation of our existence, right? But so that's miracle one. And then miracle two is how do we get complex systems in a closed universe? This is like a detailed physics thing we don't need to get into, but entropy should increase over time. But look around, like this is a very organized world compared to like the vacuum of space or a black hole or something. Complexity emerges, and that's another miracle in an unguided system. It's not a miracle in a guided system, which is the religious view. And then there's abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is how did we get life from non-life? And atheists actually have no answer for this. And I always thought they did. I always thought, oh, well, evolution. But evolution only explains how, if you take it at face value, it explains how you get a new species from another species. It doesn't explain how the very first life came from non-life. And you look at the explanations of abiogenesis, and they're kind of absurd. One is panspermia from the discoverer of DNA, one of the discoverers, which is that microorganisms came to Earth on comets, and that just kicks the can down the road because where did that life come from? And then the other explanation is that molecules just started bumping into, this is Dawkins' explanation, molecules just started bumping into each other in oceans, and every once in a while, two of them stuck. And from that, we got a system of code that can pass traits down through the generations. And, now we have TikTok. And it just is not, it's a miracle, right? Abiogenesis is very clearly a miracle. So I'm like, okay, to be an atheist, I need to believe in like at least, and then there's fine tuning. So I need to believe in like 4 miracles. Okay. So I said, well, if I'm going to believe in miracles, I should kind of explore some other explanations too. Right. And, you really only have to believe one miracle to be a Christian. And so I got to explore this idea, and I did.
So talk with us through that. How, first of all, did you know any believers in your life? Were you doing this investigation on your own? What did that look like? How did you start addressing some of these doubts and questions?
I did. I knew plenty of believers, but I had been such a antagonistic person to them, right? So I didn't really feel comfortable. Again, I felt kind of hypocritical going to them and say, okay, I know I've been a jerk all these years, but can you explain to me what you think? My pride didn't let me do that. So I just kind of started investigating it on my own. I've listened to some other episodes and other things like this, and I am always a little envious of people that have like this like aha moment, whether it's God literally speaking to them or just like an event that happens in their life and they're changed immediately. It didn't work like that for me. It was like 3 years of different things going on in my life. I had children. It's a big deal. And then I also I was a little perplexed why Christians seem to be so maligned compared to other religions. Like there was like this weird double standard, which immediately kind of piques my interest. If you're sort of a contrarian, you're like, why is everyone picking on them so much? Maybe they got the answers, right? So that was going on. And then this scientific thing I've detailed was going on. I really was realizing that I built my entire worldview on rationality and logic, but my worldview is not rational or logical. Right? So this is a problem. And so once I finally crossed that bridge, I was able to sort of like put my ego aside and say, okay, you need to just start reading some stuff, the Bible. And also talking to those handful of few friends I was comfortable talking about this with, And it was a 3-year process, and it was incremental. It was like, okay, maybe there is something out there. Maybe there is a creator. That was like step one. Maybe there is an afterlife. And maybe this story about Jesus really did happen. So it was like incremental, and now I'm all the way in.
Mm. So were you looking in terms of, again, investigating these bigger questions, perhaps how can science fit with better with reality, not only answering these mechanistic questions that science does, but also these larger questions. Were you looking to experts like John Lennox, for example? Were you looking at, I'm just trying to get a more granular view of
Yeah.
what your pathway looked like. What were the voices that you were listening? Who were the voices you were listening to? What were the books that you were reading? How were you gaining this new perspective that perhaps God does exist, that perhaps science and belief in God do go together in a coherent way?
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
great question, because you're right. It wasn't just me seeing the hypocrisy in my worldview. It was also, people like you mentioned, John Lennox, guy's incredible. And there's this whole suite of people who are clearly incredibly smart and intelligent, who believe. And so that was certainly a model, because I was afraid of looking foolish, right? When you mock an idea for 20 years, and then all of a sudden you espouse that idea, you are nervous to to switch teams, basically. And I still am. I still struggle with that. If I could tell a quick story before I answer your questions, a few weeks ago, a family member called and said, "Hey, Trevor, my son called me about your book that just came out, and he says you're a Jesus freak now." And man, that just triggered like some ancient stuff from when I was an atheist. And that was like, it bothered me. And I was like, and I felt like Peter. I was like, well, no, not exactly. It's really a book about science and physics and blah blah blah. And that like wrecked me for 2 weeks. I was doing some serious introspection, like, why didn't I just say yeah? You know, and I realized it wasn't the implication that I believed in Jesus that bothered me. It was the implication that I believed in Jesus and that was irrational that bothered me, because I had just undergone this like 3-year journey of, in my mind, proving to myself that this was actually the correct and rational worldview. And anyway, so to your point, seeing people like Lennox and Stephen Meyer and Michael Behe and these guys, I was like, oh, I can approach this way, in a way that doesn't make me feel like a hypocrite. So maybe that's just my ego, but also in a way that satisfies that part of me that doesn't that is nervous that I'm just going to believe something blindly that's incorrect, because that exists in humans. Humans believe things that aren't true, right? So I wanted to satisfy that part of me that felt like this was a logical understanding and correct. The idea that this really old book, actually described things that happened, and that's actually true. Um, so yeah, there's is it Lee Strobel that I quote in the book, where, and John Lennox too, this idea that in nature you observe patterns everywhere. A seashell follows like a Fibonacci sequence, and ripples in the sand. You go, oh, nature did that. You can come up with like a natural explanation, a scientific explanation. But when you see, Jason loves Susie carved in a tree, or when you see a sign that says exit and it conveys intelligible meaning to you, that's the sign of an intelligent mind. And the fact that at the center of ourselves is an information system written in a code that we've now disentangled and can understand, in my mind, it's more rational and more logical to believe that that comes from a mind. I have to believe that there is a creator who built this finely tuned universe for life to emerge. And yeah, so all those thinkers like Lennox and Strobel and Behe were hugely influential.
So you were open-minded enough when you were reading all of this information that you could see that the argument or the evidence, I guess, best explanation for what we're seeing and observing in the world might lie in the hands of the fact that there's a transcendent source that answers all of those miracles that were
Yeah.
unexplainable
Yeah.
within science alone. You also mentioned that you opened the Bible,
Yeah.
and of course, again, coming from a very I guess reductionistic view of science, and that nature is all there is. I know you probably had a preconceived idea of what you
Oh
thought
yeah.
it was.
Yeah.
And what
Definitely.
was that preconceived idea, and how did it change once you started reading for yourself?
I assumed that the Bible was just this like moralist finger pointing list of things, you should or should not do. And many of these ideas were really antiquated and wouldn't make sense in the modern world. And I had heard all of the things about how it supports, the mistreatment of women and slavery, all these things you hear in college campuses. And yeah, so I assumed Jesus would be this very unrelatable, and God would be this very unrelatable person who was clearly the creation of the human mind, right? And I'd be able to see through that and see like, oh yeah, this is just because they thought this and they thought this. And then I read it and I'm like, oh my gosh, like this could have been written. I mean, this is directly applicable, especially the New Testament, directly applicable to our society right now. And I also expected it to be very comforting, like overly so, like a way to address death anxiety for the masses. That's not what it was at all. It was, in some ways, it was very much like, hey, if you're a Christian, you're going to be persecuted, and the path is narrow. Very few of you are going to do it right. And I was like, well, okay, so this doesn't feel like a comforting fairy tale. So that right off the bat was interesting to me. And also it wasn't like a finger wagging moralistic argument. It was kind of the opposite. It was an attack of hypocrisy. People who are finger wagging moralists but aren't living a righteous life. Those were like the enemy of the New Testament, right? The Pharisees. And I'm like, oh, it was really honestly completely antithetical to what I thought it would be. And that in and of itself made me go, why is that? Why didn't I have this understanding? Like, why has pop culture, media, why did they give me a completely different understanding of this book? And so that was big. But then also at the same time, I was going back and reading some of with the subject of the book, some of these scientists in the 1900s, even back the 1700s, 1800s, they they had they never put science forward as an alternative. They were trying to show all of these mysteries that supported the idea that there was something beyond the natural world that they didn't really understand. Um, and so I go, okay, there's a lot going on right now. My logical, rational, atheistic worldview is collapsing. I'm reading the Bible and I'm like shocked by how different it is than what I expected and how much sense it made and how relatable, you know, Jesus is. And and also at the meantime, the people that I used to worship, right? The fathers of science, they actually didn't believe what I thought they believed. So it was just sort of this multi-pronged attack on on my atheist worldview that sort of all culminated in belief.
So you came to a place of I guess belief that Jesus was a historical figure in first century
Yeah.
Palestine, or that he was who he claimed to be, God in the flesh, and all of that. And
Yeah,
it
even
sounds
even before I got to the fact that I believed he was a historical figure and a real person, I was just shocked by how much he did not feel like a creation of the human mind. Because he didn't, because you do like comparative studies of religion, and it's all sort of about making you feel better or giving one group power over another group, or just explaining away anxiety. That's not like Jesus was countercultural, very much countercultural. And it doesn't really make sense, you know, because I think the atheist perspective is like, oh, and you've heard like the communist take on religion, the opiate of the masses. And the atheist perspective is this is just something that people invented to make themselves feel better or to take power away from a certain group. And the New Testament and the Old Testament too, it doesn't feel like that at all. It actually kind of feels real. You know, it doesn't feel like a comforting story written by people. Um, but then, yeah, you start digging into, uh, you know, some of the archaeological evidence and the historical evidence, and it didn't. I had always been told that it just flat out refutes the Bible. But then I started finding out, well, that's also not true. That's another lie for some reason somebody sold to me, which again raises my suspicion even further. And yeah, so it just all happened at the same time.
So it was making sense in terms of basically, you were able to integrate science into this grander story of reality, I guess,
Yeah.
in
Hmm.
addition to the fact that you were finding that substantively the facts surrounding the biblical narrative were true and
Yeah.
substantiated through evidence. So everything was coming together. Now there's a very different understanding of belief that things are true, uh, and belief in the person of Christ. That's a different step.
Yeah.
Um, was it easier for you to make that step, or how did that happen? Was it an understanding of who you, in reading the scripture, you get this sense that God, if he does exist, he's like you were saying, just amazingly grand, but yet in the person of Christ, um, so personal, and he
Oh yeah.
knows you better than you know yourself, and he's perfect and we know that we're not. Was there
Yes.
a sense of this, like, oh my, if this is real and this is true and Jesus is who he says he is, then there's a response
Oh
that
yeah.
happens? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, that honestly, as a kid, maybe as a teenager or college student, that was sort of one of my critiques of for the religious, you know, of believers is like, man, if you really do believe that this story is true, I mean, you would conduct your life in a like a different way, you know. And so, yeah, I started reading this like, oh my gosh, you know, like I think I've been wrong, you know, which is a big deal when we're talking about eternity and salvation. And yeah, that was one of the big things is that this is such an unlikely story. You know, if you were trying, like if you sat down with a group of your buddies and you wanted to come up with a religion that was exciting and pulled people in, this probably isn't the story you would tell. You wouldn't tell people like, you need to be faithful to your wife. You need to forgive the people that have wronged you. If you follow me, you're going to be persecuted. And you wouldn't have the central figure of your religion be crucified. You know, you'd have the central figure of your religion throwing lightning bolts from the clouds like Zeus. You know, you'd have this powerful person that everyone wants on their side, right? So it's a very unlikely story. And so yeah, it didn't feel like someone sat down and said, okay, we're going to come up with this religion that's going to spread across the world and become the biggest religion in the world. But that's exactly what happened. You have this incredibly relatable human God who, you know, paid the ultimate price and suffered this horrible thing. And then anyway, so yeah, when I'm reading that, I'm just like, yeah, I really got to rethink everything, you know. So
Yeah, it is an extraordinary story, and the in a way that this extraordinary God reaches down to each of us personally
yeah,
and calls us to himself to provide a life that's, like you say, it's very counterintuitive, it's countercultural. I mean, Jesus, the countercultural figure, wants us to be like him, right? And so it's not, as you say, a religion of just mere comfort.
no,
It's a
no,
tough road. It's a road of surrender. Now, you had mentioned earlier, and I always love to ask this question. especially as a scientist, how do science and belief in God go together? How
Yeah.
can they go together? That's a real paradigm shift for you. Um, so if you could explain that, that would be
Yeah.
great.
Well, I mean, this was one thing that bothered me also about belief as a kid, was this sort of this kind of, I felt, this was just my perception. I don't actually think it's true, but my perception was that there was like this rejection of curiosity. It's like, hey, we've already got it all figured out. Here's the book. And so why explore all these other things? So that drew me to science. And then I found the same closed mindedness in science. And now, with a much deeper understanding of what science used to be, and of the Bible, I I think it is kind of obvious to me now that the two go together. I mean, first of all, um, I I got the impression that Jesus encouraged curiosity. He surrounded himself with 12 people who were constantly asking him questions, and there was never this like stern rejection of question asking. I never felt that, and so that didn't. So right off the bat, I'm like, okay, so my initial impression that this book, the Bible, rejects curiosity is not true. And also, these scientists, I mean, the subject of the book, these physicists, a lot of the things they were discovering kind of rhymed with stuff I was reading in the Bible. And we don't need to get into all of the details, but this idea that belief is central to reality. I mean, of course, Jesus says that over and over and over again. That's this recurrent theme. When he calls the disciple, is it Peter, I believe, to walk to him on the water, and as soon as he has doubt enter his mind, he falls into the water, right? And the mustard seed, being able to move the mountain with the faith. I mean, this is just all about how belief influences reality, and this is what all the 20th century physicists were saying in the 20s and 30s, is that our perception and our observation and our belief influences physical reality. So I thought was fascinating. And then I found out that the scientific principles of thermodynamics tell us that we shouldn't have this beautiful ordered world that we live in. And it just rings true in our life. I mean, what happens if I would love, say I have a home in the mountains, and I go there for 6 months to write another book, and I come back to my house. It's going to be overrun. It's going to be deteriorated, and there's going to be weeds everywhere in my garden. And it takes intervention to maintain order. And that's the second law. We shouldn't have this pocket of complexity that we live in unless someone reaches in and manipulates it. And so, yeah, all of these foundational scientific principles. I mean, I talk about photons and how information can be transferred over any distance. And you start reading the modern scientific explanations for these things, they sound like religion. Like Federico Fagin, amazing physicist, invented the CPU. So this is not, a fringe guy by any means. His current explanation of reality is that we're like a drone, where the real conscious perspective exists somewhere else and is receiving our viewpoint, our perspective, through a quantum field. And I'm like, man, that sure sounds like a spirit animating the flesh. Like, how would you describe quantum field theory to someone 2,000 years ago? Not like that. And so you'd say spirit animates the flesh. And I'm like, okay, well, the scientists, they're now trying to come up with a substitution to Christianity, I would say, using scientific vocabulary. Maybe because they don't want to swallow their pride, right? But I'm willing to accept that maybe actually the Bible was telling us this stuff all along, and that's a call for me to be more open-minded. Maybe science actually supports the themes of the Bible. And maybe we can, as humans, sort of tease apart the mechanisms of how things work. I don't think we can ever actually fully understand God or souls or spirits, but But at the very least, the modern scientific explanations are not refuting those concepts. I think they support them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, it is I just love that you are sitting there as someone who, again, is very highly trained. You are scientific. You love science. I think you say that. You say it in your book. You've said it here today. You love science. You're not dismissing science. You're just putting science in its rightful perspective. And actually, I think showing how science can actually lead to more. That
I think so.
if we are open-minded and curious and willing to look, again, your book, I just so highly encourage it. It's to look beyond our normal ways of thinking, of just merely computational, ways of considering science, and looking beyond and into the mystery of quantum mechanics, and and what that might reveal and what that
Yeah.
might imply. There's just so much there. There's a lot of mystery, but I also love the way that you're pointing to an adequate cause for what we're seeing, and order and fine tuning and life and complexity and language, code, all of those things. There has to be a sufficient cause.
We're
Um,
if I might add to that,
yeah.
we're living in a weird time right now because we're like in this transitionary time where I think rational atheism, Dawkins, Hitchens, that sort of we're kind of moving past that. And I am a little bit nervous for science and my colleagues in science that they recognize the flaws in their worldview, but rather than embrace uh, a, a different, older explanation, the Bible, um, Jesus, they're kind of trying to make a new scientific explanation that they still say is a different and better explanation, but they're using like supernatural uh, things that we traditionally would have dismissed, like quantum entanglement and the fact that maybe matter isn't really there when you're not looking at it, and they're trying to construct a new explanation that explains some of these unexplainable things without using the word God for some reason. I mean, people use the word universe now to mean God. Like the universe just told me, or I think this is what the universe is trying to say, and the quantum field instead of spirit, and the all these things. And I'm a little worried that's the direction the field is going to kind of go. There are still some very hyper rationalist reductionist fields in science. My field is definitely one of them, neuroscience, and it was a study of free will that I think actually, even before quantum mechanics, kind of pushed me in this direction, because there was this insistence that we didn't have to explain the feeling of being alive. And what I mean by that is I feel like I'm in here and I'm thinking up the next words I'm going to say, and I'm saying them to you, and you're hearing them, and you're thinking your own thoughts and you're replying to me. And it's not just like we're automatons, like two AI chatbots talking to each other, using mathematical algorithms to determine the next best word to say. Like, no, we're actually, like, we're in here, we're experiencing it. It does kind of seem like there's something special about being in your mind, observing your life, observing your inner world and your outer world. And neuroscience just said, no, there isn't. And the burden of proof is on you, person who thinks that this subjective experience is real, to prove us otherwise. And so, I'm very familiar with fMRI and all of these studies that show, like, this is the network where consciousness exists. And I'm just not even a little bit convinced. And I think a lot of neuroscientists aren't. They just don't want to go against the grain. It's usually not a good career move, but it's just very unconvincing.
No, I hear you. It seems so counterintuitive to deny your basic experience, even
Yes.
of life, that you are a person who's making choices, and to deny your own humanity in that way. feels irrational to me.
It really does.
So maybe it will be, you mentioned Stephen Meyer earlier, maybe it will be a return of the God hypothesis.
I hope so.
In some ways, hopefully your work will help guide people or open people's mind. How would you describe your your perspective now that you have a fuller sense of reality, a fuller explanation of reality? Would you say that your worldview is bigger and makes more sense? It's more corresponding with reality, like within our
Yeah.
own human experiences. Would you say that it has made a difference to you, professionally as well as personally?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think people accuse the religious worldview of being like discordant with reality, but it's the exact opposite. I mean, to deny that consciousness exists, like you said, is to deny the fundamental experience of being alive. So, how could you not have some kind of like internal chaos holding that view that this is an illusion? And it's true because when you talk, like, is it Sam Harris? He talks about like, yeah, free will is an illusion, but I find that my life works much better if I just assume it's true. I was like, okay, well, if you have to if you have to assume my argument to live, then there's something wrong with your argument. And yeah, it's completely incompatible, I think. And so you just, as an atheist, you just kind of have to box that somewhere else and just ignore it. And so it's not a worldview that works if you have to ignore all these fundamental principles. But there's this effect that people like to quote in science all the time, usually being critical of religious worldview, but to just kind of turn it back on them, this Dunning-Kruger effect, which is, when you learn a little bit about a topic, your perceived competence just skyrockets, right? But then the more you learn, the less confident you become, right? And that's certainly the case with this. I mean, the more I study the actual scientific explanations for things, the more I go, whoa, like there's no way for me to feel confident saying that there's purely scientific explanations for this, or at least scientific explanations that don't have a creator at the bottom of them somewhere. And so, yeah, the more I learn, the more open-minded I get.
I think there are some people listening to you, and they may have had some questions or thought, I feel that I'm protecting something that really doesn't make sense. I don't like living in these useful fictions,
Yeah,
right? I have to live as if I'm making decisions, as if I have a mind that
right.
I'm thinking, I'm acting, I'm moving, I'm making a difference. I'm not just merely a determined, being. But and they're listening to you, and they're thinking, okay, he's intelligent, he's thought about these things, he's a scientist. And they would be willing to be curious enough to consider that there may be something more
Yeah,
than the closed reductionistic worldview of scientism. How would you encourage somebody who's willing to take that next step, with their curiosity, with their openness, um, and even in spite of, to your earlier point, that they may have had some prior religious pain or hurt? We all have confirmation biases, and we all have
yeah,
issues, and but yet we all, in a sense, want to know what's true.
yeah,
And so, how can you encourage somebody to just kind of look beyond whether it's hurt or prior, our own, just get ourselves out of the way,
yeah.
really, to look for what's really true?
Just having lived that, what you're describing, having lived that experience, I would say first, maybe even before you jump into the scripture, just examine your worldview first. Like, go back and read what Heisenberg thought, and Max Planck, and Louis Pasteur, and all these like foundational folks. What did they believe? And it's going to be very different than what you believe as a rational atheist, even though you might be quoting their experimental findings, right? Or at least findings that came from them. Heisenberg has a famous quote, the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences makes you an atheist, but at the bottom, God is waiting. It's a great quote. And Louis Pasteur has an almost identical quote. And that's actually a true experience. So if you're an atheist because you have a little bit of knowledge about scientific history, maybe try to get a lot of knowledge about scientific history, because you might actually find God waiting at the bottom of the glass. Second thing is, if you have been hurt by religion, which I never really, I would say, was hurt by religion, but there was certain flaws I saw in religion that I really honed in on. If you're one of those people, you need to really start trying to distinguish between God and the human institutions that exist on earth to worship him. And it's not that there's anything wrong with those institutions. It's just acknowledge that those two things are separate, because most of the pushback I get is pushback on religion. And I'm like, I'm not even talking about religion in the book. I'm talking about God. And so just read, once you're a little bit more open-minded, and once you've examined your own scientific worldview has its flaws, I would go start reading, at least for me, the story of Jesus was by far the most compelling thing. And just go read that and come to your own conclusions, and differentiate the man, the God described in that book, from whatever weird experiences you had that pushed you away from the church. That'd be my advice.
I think that's very, very wise. And for those who want to find the story of Jesus in the Bible, where would they go?
First 4 books of the New Testament. It's actually an incredibly short story, which was surprising to me. I just assumed the whole Bible was going to be about Jesus. It's really the same story told 4 times from 4 different perspectives: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I also, not to get into like a biblical history thing, but it's we now know that these books were written, at least Mark and Matthew, at pretty much the time of Jesus. And so this is not this like fanciful mythological thing. It's probably an eyewitness account. And so why wouldn't you want to read an eyewitness account of even if you don't believe he's God, why wouldn't you want to go read an influential account of the most influential man, if that's what you think he is, to ever live?
And for us as Christians, I know that that there are, we know people like you, or you were, that just thought at one time that science did have all the answers, and they're not really open towards another perspective. How can we as Christians meaningfully engage someone like that who might be resistant or think that they know it all?
It's tough. I mean, having been that person, I don't know what someone could have said to me. It may just be something that people just have to come to themselves, and it's probably God who needs to soften that person's heart, but maybe not. I mean, I think it is probably useful. I mean, listen, that's what I try to do in the book. That's who the book is for. Someone who is maybe not convinced that they know everything, because they're not ready. I don't think anything can convince that person. But once that first chink in the armor happens, and someone starts kind of opening their mind and going, yeah, this doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, that's who the book's for. So I think it's like, okay, you think you know everything about how the universe was created. Well, do you know that the people who invented this stuff didn't feel that way? Like, do you know that Einstein didn't feel that way? Do you know that Heisenberg didn't feel that way? Planck, the people who actually came up with these theories, you're not trying to say you're smarter than Einstein and Planck and Bohr and Heisenberg, right? So that is kind of one approach I think that would have worked on me, because that's just a level of hubris that I think even the biggest know-it-all can't swallow, right? If it's someone in your life that's important to you, I don't think you should just go out and harass people, but maybe you should. But if it's someone in your life that's important to you, you need to force them to contend with those questions, because they can't. And there's only really one explanation that does, and that's the religious explanation.
Yeah, that's excellent. Trevor, thank you so much for really bringing so much to the table today. I love your voice. Again, in my experience, in my research, it seems like those who were wrestling with some kind of cognitive dissonance with their own worldview had enough intellectual integrity and honesty to pursue the answers, find themselves in a very different place than they ever thought as believers in God who once called themselves atheists. And you are a living, breathing example of that, and someone who's actually trying to open the door for others to see.
Yeah.
And so I just thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate the writing that you've done. I encourage anyone again to go take a look at Trevor's book, God's Eye View. And it's, again, well worth your time, well worth your reading and your investment. But at the end of the day, you're sitting here as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. And of that, I'm most thankful of all.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you so much, Trevor, for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of eX-skeptic. Trevor's story reminds us that true intellectual courage means being willing to follow the evidence, even when it challenges our most deeply held assumptions. Once convinced that science had all the answers and faith was for the weak, Trevor came to see that science alone couldn't account for the fullness of human consciousness or meaning or experience. His openness to reconsider and his pursuit of truth ultimately led him to a place he never expected: belief in God. If Trevor's story resonated with you, or if you're on your own journey of questioning and exploration, we invite you to visit us at eX-skeptic.org and explore our curated playlists, sign up for our email, and join the conversation on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd like to explore your questions in conversation with one of our guests, we'd love to help. Just email us at info@eX-skeptic.org and we'll get you connected. eX-skeptic is part of the C.S. Lewis Institute podcast network. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, rate it, or share it with someone who you might think would benefit from hearing stories like these. Thanks again for listening, and be sure to join us next time, where we'll hear another unlikely story of belief.